Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Pennell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. John Pennell, who is an accomplished retired U.S. Senior Foreign Service Officer with over 20 years of executive level experience leading multidisciplinary, interagency, and joint teams to oversee U.S. cooperation programs across Africa, Eurasia, the Indo-Pacific, Latin America, and the Middle East. He has deep expertise in irregular warfare, strategic competition, public diplomacy, strategic communications, and countering hybrid threats, including high-threat, gray zone, and other active combat environments. John Pennell, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks, John. Really appreciate you having me on. It's great to be here. I'm a lifetime member of the Information Professionals Association, IPA, and so really happy to be on the podcast.
Yeah. Well, thanks for lending your voice to the forum, and thank you as well for supporting IPA and its mission. And to our audience, we welcome anybody else to join IPA and support our mission as well. There's a link in the show notes. So the conversation I'd like to have with you today, John, will cover your book, which is also a book version of your Ph.D. Dissertation, I believe, assessing Russia's actions in Ukraine and Syria from 2014 to 2022, with implications for the changing character of war. And again, there is a link in the show notes for people to go and check this out for yourselves. But before we get into this topic, John, could we start by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape, or if you prefer, the times in which we live?
Certainly. Again, great to be on. That's a really important question, that initial kind of kickoff, and it's something that I've been thinking about for a number of years, going back to when I was working on my PhD thesis and then the book, and then certainly seeing these issues I'm about to discuss, I think, accelerating over the last several years. So the first big issue that I see in today's strategic environment is the increasing blurring of lines between peace and war by both state and non-state actors, which are able to harness, if you will, a full spectrum of military and non-military, or kinetic and non-kinetic tools that often operate just below the threshold of traditional conflict, if you will. We sometimes refer to this as gray zone, if you will, but also hybrid warfare or irregular warfare. The point being that a particular actor, again, it could be a state or non-state actor, can pursue and often achieve its particular objectives, political or strategic objectives, often without full-scale conflict or combat, and particularly in the information space, by manipulating perceptions, narratives, information, etc. This is by no means saying that conventional force, military or kinetic effects are not important. They absolutely still are. But the point being that more and more we're in a situation where a number of actors can use non-military means, non-kinetic means to harm, let's say, the U.S., its allies and partners, etc. Russia is really historically a leader in this field, and I'll talk more about that in a second. But the other point as well, kind of on top of all this, just the array of new technologies, tools, platforms, and the scale and speed at which they're developing is also very concerning. They're also useful tools for the U.S. and its allies and partners as well, but they can also be tools used to harm the U.S., its allies and partners. And so obviously I'm speaking about artificial intelligence, AI, and AI generated like deepfake, whether it's audio or video, but even beyond that, smartphones, social media apps, online media outlets, 24-hour information availability. All of these things can be used on the one hand to share information and folks to stay up to speed on what's going on in the world, but on the other hand, are also avenues that our adversaries can use to manipulate public perceptions or legitimacy of institutions or cohesion, if you will. And then related to that, of course, is the increasing rise of unmanned systems, whether that's aerial, land, sea, or undersea, if you will, submarine, if you will, drones, and of course, robotics, precision-guided weapons, et cetera, et cetera. And so those things combined are, I think, making the current strategic environment, I think, very threatening, if you will, and very challenging as well. And I think all of this to say, particularly with the information space and what's available publicly to the average consumer of information in the US or anywhere in the world, really. But looking at it from just the US perspective, I'm very concerned about the ability of the average person to discern, let's say, fact from fiction, what's evidence-based information versus disinformation, or let's say propaganda, or like a deep fake. And I know it's hard, I think, often for all of us as human beings to accept certain realities or information when they don't necessarily conform to our beliefs or preconceived notions. And I think a number of our adversaries are aware of that, and they do exploit those, let's say, divisions within Western societies, whether it's on a particular social issue or political issue or economic issue, what have you. And I think that's something that we really need a whole of society approach to dealing with, because it's something that I'm seeing getting worse and worse each day. And it is one way, I would say, our adversaries, with Russia historically leading this, but increasingly the PRC, but then also Iran and North Korea as well. And then a number of non-state actors, as I mentioned, and terrorist groups or violent extremist organizations, but also criminal syndicates, drug cartels, are increasingly getting active in the information space as well. And so all of these things, make me concerned about today's strategic environment, and are things that I really think that all of us need to focus on and be prepared for and develop resilience to deal with.
Right. The subtitle of your book is about implications for the changing character of war. What do you mean by that? Or what were some of your key findings there on the character of modern conflict and change or continuity relative to conflict?
Sure. So back when I started my PhD thesis, and up to the point where I ended up converting that into a book, I was actually living and working in Ukraine at the time. And so from 2015 to 2019, that gave me an opportunity to do a lot of kind of live field testing, so to speak, on what was happening in terms of at that point was, Russia had only annexed Crimea with its so-called Little Green Men, these unmarked forces that, without insignias, that they would have some plausible deniability that they were actually Russian, but we all knew that they were, and later confirmed that they were. But then its activities in eastern Ukraine and the Donetsk basin, or Donbass region, if you will. And I just wanted to better understand in terms of my work, but then also looking at it as a research opportunity as well. All the discussion within US and Western policy circles about hybrid warfare, about Russian activities, whether or not what Russia was doing at that time, let's say 2014 to 2015 or so, was new, or whether it was an ongoing larger scale long-term influence campaign that Russia had dating back to the Soviet era in Ukraine in particular. And so thinking about that question about the changing character of war, I looked at it in terms of, are we seeing change or continuity? Are we seeing evolution or revolution? And what I ended up concluding, maybe no surprise, I really saw more change, more continuity than change. Sorry about that. Going back to the Soviet Cold War era, but even earlier, Imperial Russia, if you will, what was called, at least during the Cold War era, active measures, the use of full spectrum tools, if you will, particularly in the information space, but beyond the information space, non-military tools, assassinations, blackmail, economic pressure, influencing political candidates, etc., putting so-called, pro-Russia experts into think tanks or on news media outlets, that sort of thing. These types of activities Russia was doing quite a bit in Ukraine, even prior to the Euromaidan and then Revolution of Dignity in 2013, 2014. But then they accelerated that in those initial years.
So could I ask about that? So
Sure.
you were just citing like a deliberate, I don't know, intentional, thoughtful ways of, I guess, what, like honeycombing into positions of like mid-level authority. I don't know, operatives might not be the right word, but Russian people who are aligned with Russia's agenda into various different boards and places where they can have a like policy level impact, but doing that in a strategic way from the top. Is that what you're trying to describe?
Yes, exactly. I think one key advantage that Russia had in Ukraine at that time was, and it's changed quite a bit. I'm happy to talk about some of those changes. But in those early years of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, going back to 2014, Russia had already had a footprint in Ukraine. And I'm talking about a military footprint, yes, in terms of the Black Sea fleet, but also a agents of influence footprint, so to speak. So meaning that there were a number of politicians, Ukrainian politicians who were, pro-Russia politicians, and they were members of parties that often backed policies coming out of Moscow, or there were oligarchs who had business interests in Russia, or made their money from connections to Russia, particularly in the energy sector, or they were people who owned different media channels, which had all the flashy entertainment programs that many people watched, which are often backed by, let's say, Russian money or Ukrainian pro-Russia money, if you will. So they didn't necessarily have to do a whole lot more, although they did accelerate these types of activities. But they already had their claws into the system, so to speak, politically and economically, but then also social institutions as well, including the church and a number of other institutions also.
Wow.
And I think the other key point too, and this is why I think Russia's activities in Ukraine can't necessarily be replicated in the same way in every other place that Russia has operated, because Russia and Ukraine do historically have longstanding, ethnic, linguistic, geographic, cultural, religious ties, etc., particularly for those populations in the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine. So they themselves often were the targets of Russian information campaigns in terms of influencing their thinking about what was happening in the capital, Kyiv, at that time, and describing the Revolution of Dignity, as it was called by the new Ukrainian government at the time and its Western allies, instead calling it, a fascist coup, a fascist takeover by neo-Nazi groups, or the new power centers coming into play in Ukraine are actually anti-Russian, and they're going to take away your Russian language, your identity, et cetera, et cetera. So Russia was very, very good at playing on that. The only other environment, I think, in the kind of the post-Soviet, former Soviet space that's kind of similar, I think Belarus would be another place where if Russia wanted to do similar activities, I think it would be able to do so fairly easily. But obviously, Russia and Belarus are very, very closely aligned, so it doesn't necessarily need to do that.
Well,
So,
if I could, just for a
sure,
moment, John. Yeah, so there was another episode that we had with a gentleman named Dan Runde, and I'll put a link to
yes.
this in the show notes, but he was describing a similar method, I guess, that China has been deploying for many years as well, where China has been deliberately getting people voted into various different bodies of international bodies of influence, and it's not they're not always, or maybe they're frequently not, like prestigious, you know, uh, headline worthy positions, but nevertheless, they're, serious people with an agenda, being legitimized internationally onto, UN bodies, into, these little committees that help decide, how policy is being set, internationally. And when you do it, dozens or hundreds of times in these, micro committees, it has an effect. And it sounds like Russia pursues a similar kind of agenda in their own way, that is aligns with Russia's agenda.
Yes, 100%. And I know Dan from my time in the government, and
Ah,
so yes, he's spot on that as well. I think the PRC China in particular is doing that even more in the information space, and one way to do it, as you just described, is to have more of its people on, in these different international organizations, kind of advancing its agenda. So that's something that's been going on quite extensively.
mm,
Um, I think for Russia in particular, and particularly, looking at some of the recent trends over the last few days, and in the news has been widely reported. China's military parade marking I guess, the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II,
mm,
and the fact that you had leaders from India, Russia, North Korea there as well. Some have referred to the four leaders of those countries as the axis of upheaval, whatever they may be called. Certainly, I think there's a lot of concern out there about their interest in creating an alternative view of the world, or pole in the world, if you will, opposite to the one historically led by the U.S. since the end of World War II in 1945. And there are a number of other organizations out there, beyond the UN organizations. For example, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, and then of course the one focused more on economics, but BRICS, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and all these different forums, if you will, do provide an opportunity for Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, etc., or whomever else is involved, to pursue visions of the world and strategies that implement those visions, if you will, that may not conform to the U.S.-led Western view, or even be against it. And so I think that's something that we certainly need to watch out for even more. And again, kind of going back to my point related to the book about kind of more continuity than change, I would also see more evolution than revolution.
mm,
I think the only potential, maybe we need to review again soon, is how much AI could change and make it more revolutionary than evolutionary in terms of when we used to talk about the revolution in military affairs. I think we still need to see, maybe the jury is still out, but I think the role of AI and its use for military purposes, I think we still need to see what that looks like in terms of being an evolutionary versus revolutionary. But certainly, I think kind of what's been different is just the array of new tools out there and technologies out there that can certainly make it easier for adversaries to do nefarious things. Obviously, those same tools and technologies can be used by the U.S. allies and partners as well to pursue its own interest also. But I think the point being that we're just in a situation, in my view, that it could be more and more highly contested.
Right. I can I can see people like having, perhaps without giving it a whole lot of thought, thinking about the, as you mentioned earlier, the rise in autonomous weapons and AI playing more of a role in warfare. Just again, maybe without a whole lot of thought, being like, oh, it's a revolution. But is it really a revolution? Eh, so I mean, I guess that's just to ask you, like, what would make something a revolution in warfare compared to what you're calling it as an evolution?
Certainly. Great question. So I think I think it goes back to the first Gulf War, in particular, in the early 90s, 1991, 1991, when at that point we saw the use of more precision-guided weapons. We saw the ability of, let's say, U.S. forces at that point, in terms of command and control systems. While there were boots on the ground, of course, I think many who were watching what the U.S. was doing at that time, particularly its adversaries, particularly Russia, that war itself is what ushered in Russia's view. And also, China has spoken about this quite a bit in terms of its analysis of what it called unrestricted warfare. But they consider the first Gulf War as really a revolutionary change in how war was conducted. Precision-guided weapons, but the fact that you could also be in one part of, let's say, the Middle East and launch strikes from somewhere else, and not necessarily have to have boots on the ground and have to have, face-to-face combat at that point in time. And I think just the new technologies that are introduced in that war, and then I think have evolved over time, are things that I think started to lead to greater discussion within the revolutionary military affairs literature about, okay, now that we've got more precision-guided weapons, what does that mean for force structure? What does that mean for posture? What does that mean for technology that we need or use, or that sort of thing? How fast can we achieve our objectives? And I think that the jury is still out on AI, whether it will just be something that enables the tools that are already being developed, or if it's something that will really lead to fundamental change. I'm not sure yet. It is something that I think we do need to monitor quite closely because, again, a lot of these technologies are available to our adversaries just as much as they are, let's say, to the U.S. or its allies. And, back during the first Gulf War, I think arguably at that point, the technologies that I've just been describing, like the precision-guided weapons and the way the command and control systems were set up, were somewhat unique to the U.S. or maybe its allies. But now we're seeing more and more of that being utilized by adversaries as well.
You make the point that you think that it's rather than calling Russia's brand, I guess, of warfare, hybrid warfare, which is something that we hear a lot. You are you suggest calling it like new generation warfare or political warfare. How do you qualitatively separate those out, and why do you make that claim?
Certainly. So that's another area of the research that led to the book, because the term hybrid was used so often,
Hmm.
and many terms are used, but that seemed to be the most common one, at least among the U.S. and kind of Western policy circles. If you think about it, going back to the history of war, every war has had some hybridity, if you will, meaning that if you look at deception, even if you read Sun Tzu's The Art of War, Sun Tzu talks about deception and how much can be achieved without actually fighting. If you look at kind of Russian concepts of maskirovka, which is another word for like deception, or at least in the current context of kind of masking, hiding what your true intentions are.
Mm.
This is something that I think arguably has always existed. So then the question becomes, why throw around another term?
Mm.
Why get caught up in a discussion about, because what it would seemingly lead to, at least at that point in time, about 10 years ago, was kind of going down a path of, oh, well, Russia is inventing a new form of warfare. And so I think the evidence shows that, well, actually, no, this is kind of where the continuity is. They've always been doing active measures, what Russia would call active measures, or what we were calling at the time hybrid warfare, going back to the Soviet era. And so while I too today still use hybrid
Hmm.
as one of the terms, it's not my preferred term. So full spectrum, I think in my mind, better captures in terms of meaning using all tools that a state has at its disposal, or an actor has. It could be a non-state actor as well. New generation warfare is actually a term that the Russians use themselves, and often to describe what it sees as the US or the West doing against Russia. And the same thing with the term hybrid warfare. It's something that, going back over the last 10 years or so, Russia has been saying that this is what the United States has been doing against Russia for decades. And it's quite interesting. As part of my research, and this is all available publicly online, if you look at Russian foreign policy strategies, its national security strategy, its military doctrine, its information security doctrine, if you will, all these issues that we're discussing about hybridity, about kind of what the West is doing, about non-kinetic tools or tools that have non-kinetic effects, um, or whole of society or whole of government approaches to conflict, are things that Russia has been talking about for decades. And it's often in the context of the US is encroaching or overreaching or undermining us, Russia, and our own traditional sphere of influence, if you will. And therefore, we need to be on the defensive, and we need to go on the offensive to prevent the US from doing this. Now, I'm describing what the Russians perceive based on their public statements and what's available publicly from their official strategy and doctrine, not necessarily my view, of course. Kind of what got caught up around that same time was this notion of the Gerasimov doctrine. And
Mm.
Gerasimov was the equivalent of the Joint Chief of Staff
Well,
of Russia.
do you know what he is doing right now? I saw some
Yeah.
news about him within the last 6 months or something that he was pulled out of his basically like chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff position and was sent down. I don't know whether he was demoted or whether he was detailed over to be like, no, you're going into a fighting position now, like a leadership frontline
Right.
leadership position. But do you have any idea what his status is currently?
No, I heard the same thing, but my understanding more recently was if that did happen, that he's still maintaining that title as like chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
Okay.
But I had heard the same thing, and also about their Minister of Defense, Shoigu, as well. Obviously, Russia suffered a lot of losses on the battlefield in Ukraine, and particularly very, high level, flag officer losses on the battlefield, which also,
Mm-hmm.
For separate conversation, it would be interesting to look at how conventionally, Russia fights on the ground and its use of senior leaders in combat as well. So quite different. But no, my understanding is he is still in that position, but I had also heard that he may have been relegated to a more of an active combat role as well. But I have not heard anything recently.
Wow. I think you were just starting to touch on this just a little bit, but I wanted to ask you, John, a little bit more directly. So we've had a couple of conversations with Russian or a communications information expert. His name is Randy Rosine, but just in the last couple of weeks here, he came back on to talk more about the different ways that both Russia and China look at information, like fundamentally, and why that should matter to Western practitioners and national security leaders. Do you think you could take a beat and
Sure.
give your version or your observations of just some of the fundamental differences in the way Russia sees the world, sees the nature of information and how that relates to this whole problem space.
Certainly. And I do think that this is one of the core sources of tension or conflict, if you will, between the United States and Russia historically, but certainly, let's say, over the last 20 plus years. I think whereas we in the West tend to see information and the availability of information as a public good, and so we see the internet, social media apps, AI, 24-hour news availability, et cetera, all these things as a public good, a social good, if you will. And I think arguably, yes, of course, should be seen that way. I think Russia, kind of going back to the point I made earlier about if you look at its strategy, its policy, its doctrine, sees the world, its starting point, its view of the world from the starting point, it's quite different from ours. It is, they see the world as one in which it's being led by the US, at least since 1945, and certainly since the end of the Cold War. And in its view, in Russia's view, that the US, NATO, the European Union, and all of its allies and partners are increasingly encroaching upon Russian space or traditional sphere of influence, if you will, and that Russia must operate from a defensive posture. That's just the starting point. And there's no room for, at least as of now, for a different view of the world, or there's no, unfortunately, in my view, kind of common ground where if we want to take a few steps back and let's say see where we can meet and then start from that, it's just very, very hard because the Russian view of the world is quite different from ours. And if you see that as their starting point, and then also looking historically that the fact that they, have been invaded by, going back many years, obviously Napoleon and then, Nazi Germany, etc. They do have this natural fear of being surrounded or invaded. And its starting posture is that we must protect ourselves. And historically, this has been happening to us. And so, it does see EU or NATO enlargement as a threat. It does see Ukraine's democratic trajectory, if you will, as a threat to itself and to its own stability. It's always considered Ukraine as a buffer state and part of its sphere of influence. And with that as the starting point, if you look at the information space, everything that Russia does in the information space is weaponized in the sense that it knows that, you know, it can't outdo the US or the West in a conventional combat arena, if you will. But what else can it do to, you know, undermine, you know, Western cohesion, American cohesion, if you will? And it's not only Russia, but also increasingly China, and then of course Iran and North Korea and others as well are doing this more and more. But what can it do using other tools at its disposal to make it more difficult for the US to, again, going to Russia's starting worldview that it's being undermined and encroached upon, to make it more difficult for the US or the West to do so. And one of the ways that it's quite effective and getting more effective and historically been quite good at is in the information space. And this, again, goes back to the Cold War era. You know, I mentioned active measures and all the different things that it would do in terms of active measures, from like political influence operations to disinformation, propaganda, to blackmail, to economic coercion, to a range of other things. The fact that we have all these new tools and technologies, frankly, makes it even easier for Russia to pursue activities in the information space. And with AI and the possibility of deep fakes, there are a lot of things that Russia can do to undermine Western perceptions, public perceptions, if you will, among the average American or a Westerner about what Russia is, what it's about, what it's doing. And that makes it harder and harder, you know, for, let's say, Western governments to, you know, hold Russia to account for its activities. And so even going back to the Soviet era, again, this notion of reflexive control, the idea that, again, Russia's starting point, as it must be in a defensive posture because it's being undermined and you can't trust the West or the EU or NATO because they're trying to surround or undermine Russia, et cetera, that, again, understanding its weaker posture militarily or conventionally vis-a-vis the US or NATO, it must use other means. And so this notion of reflexive control, the idea being, going back to the Soviet era again, that we can do certain things in the information space that Russia would believe would lead to certain perceptions being formed in the US or certain potential outcomes that would favor Russian objectives, if you will. And I think that's something that they're quite good at, have gotten much better at. And I think others are learning from that. I think for better or worse, what we are seeing in Ukraine, particularly since the full-scale invasion since February 2022, is really a laboratory, if you will, for other actors, you know, let alone for the US and NATO and its allies, et cetera, to learn from, you know, what Russia's doing, but also how Ukraine is responding, not only in terms of conventional or more advanced military technologies, but also in some of the information space areas, cyber operations, and these sorts of things. So this is kind of how I guess I would best answer that. But it's just something that is, I think, long-standing in Russian strategic culture, and it's not something new for Russia at all. It is something I think, you know, unless there's someone who studied, you know, Soviet or Russian strategic culture or, you know, military thought over the years, I think the average person is just not going to know that Russia's worldview is just quite different from the way we see it. You know, particularly even at the end of the Cold War, I think there were a number of people, including many leading scholars who, called the end of history and that sort of thing. And we thought that this would usher in a new great era of U.S.-Russia relations, et cetera. And, the 90s were extremely bumpy and rocky for Russia and many other former Soviet republics. Things have improved, but obviously things have gotten much worse in Russia and for Russians, let alone for Ukrainians as well as a result of Russian aggression.
Right. Well, so do you think that NATO's expansion, starting in the 1990s all the way through to, 2023 and 2024 has contributed to, I think you said, Russia's, I don't know, feeling of uh, like uneasiness and relative to the West. And I have to say, I just pulled this up. I um, did not realize how many countries had been added to NATO since the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, but it's like 15 or so countries, with the last countries being Finland in 2023 and Sweden in 2024. But uh, so I guess two questions, and all this is like really complicated and and needs its own episode probably. But um, uh, so Finland and Sweden were added here recently, uh, but those additions, which are, more or less, or well, Finland in particular is like also directly on the Russian border. Why did that not generate the same kind of like red line uh, response from Russia as the notion of Ukraine becoming a NATO country? Obviously there's differences in geography, but you know, Finland's addition is like 800 miles of Russian border, but then again, it's a much different location than Ukraine. But anyway, I don't know. To respond to that in any way you think is
Sure.
productive, and obviously we don't have time to explore it fully.
Certainly. Yeah, it's a great question. So I think a few different things. So point number one, if you will, I mean, obviously all these countries joining NATO are independent countries, and there are very stringent requirements to becoming a NATO member, let alone a European Union member. And if these independent sovereign countries choose to apply for membership in those organizations, I think that's up to them to do so. And, the voting publics in those countries have the say, of course. I think, again, kind of looking historically, point number two, I think Russia has always seen Ukraine as part of its sphere of influence, not necessarily Finland or Sweden, although, maybe it does. And, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, whereas Finland and Sweden were not. So I think there's kind of a subtle difference there. But then, the last point, and I think also just very important, I think as we've seen, Russian activities over the years, not only in Ukraine, but elsewhere, in terms of its activities that are still ongoing in different parts of Europe, but even in the UK as well, with some assassinations. And when I was serving in Ukraine, there are a number of assassinations of dissident Russian politicians or Ukrainian politicians on the streets of Ukraine while I was there. And so they're doing a lot of nefarious things. And I think, these countries who want to join NATO or become a part of the EU have a right to do so if they so choose. I don't think Russia's been showing itself as being a reliable counterpart in terms of negotiating in good faith, if you will. Of course, having said that, as I mentioned a couple of times, their initial starting posture is that they're under encroachment by the West, if you will. There has been an avenue for U.S. Russia, obviously talks. There's been an avenue for NATO Russia engagement as well. But I think just that the worldviews are so diametrically opposed that there just hasn't been enough positive movement there. And I do think a number of these countries, like in Scandinavia or in Eastern Europe, I think rightly so, do see Russia as a threat. And we know that Russia's conducted activities in Poland, let alone in Germany, in the Balkans, again, in the UK and elsewhere. So, they're not showing that there can be a lot of trust in them. And so,
right.
But again, we're in a situation where trust is so low on both sides. It's hard to get anywhere, and where there's no like commonality as a starting point, that makes it even more difficult. I do think, however, there was a glimmer of hope about, early on in the global war on terror, if you will. The U.S. and Russia were very cooperative on counterterrorism operations and sharing of information. Then also, of course, on nuclear non-proliferation. Those things, unfortunately, have kind of gone by the wayside. So I think we just have to see kind of what happens from here.
Okay. All right. Well, uh, uh, as a scholar, John, we like to ask people like you to suggest to students or others who are pursuing this kind of a study, what is a research topic or some remaining questions that need to be asked that a student might explore in order to advance our knowledge in this national security space?
It's also a very great question. I think there are several things that are still out there that need further research. One would be the point about informing the American public, if you will, better informing the American public about the threats in the information space coming from our adversaries. And again, while it's good that we have access to so much information through so many different means, how to better discern kind of what's fact from fiction, how to better find evidence-based information, and to the extent that we can also, and this is hard for all of us as human beings, overcome preconceived notions about things and accept facts as they are, and not necessarily how we want them to be. And I know this whole topic is very wide and encompassing, but I think thinking about that in terms of national security implications is very important. I think also looking at, is kind of the second idea, looking at increasingly what the PRC is doing, let alone like Iran and North Korea, but also non-state actors. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we typically think of terrorist or violent extremist organizations as the non-state actors, but really increasingly criminal syndicates, drug cartels as well, what they're doing in the information space to influence perceptions among, let's say, different governments, law enforcement in particular areas or local populations, and how they're using information as well to achieve their objectives. Then also, I think maybe a third suggestion is looking at kind of the evolution of Russian information operations, over the last 10 years or so, looking at the time frame, let's say between 2014 and 2022, which was the focus of my book, but then also looking at it since 2022 when the war became far more conventional, and looking at perceptions in Russia as to why there needed to be a change in approach in 2022 and kind of what that means going forward.
Wow. Okay. Fantastic. Those are great suggestions for uh, 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 motivated members of the audience, or students who are going into the various different masters and PhD national security related courses to consider and take a crack at. And with that, John Pennell, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you very much. It's great to be on. Thanks again.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.